Hello, my name's Mark Hinchin. I'm the Academic Director for South Pacific College of Natural Medicine Programs. This is a 2022 Term 1 Professional Development Session, and the Professional Development Session is on adult learning principles. What I'm going to do for this particular presentation is turn off my video, and I will share with you the PowerPoint presentation for this particular professional development. I'll work through that PowerPoint presentation with you, and if you have any questions, please contact me via email, or if you would like to meet with me, you are most welcome to. Let's get started on today's professional development session. So as I mentioned, what we'll look at today is a topic on adult learning principles. And adult learning principles are really important here at South Pacific College because our student body is full of adult learners. So moving from a previous professional development that spoke about the concept of pedagogy, we're wanting to move into teaching that's directed towards andragogy, which is adult learning theory. So let's jump in and have a look at that. So we have some session objectives. Those session objectives are: the objective of this professional development session is to identify, that's the first, and then apply the 6 principles of adult education. So as you go through this particular professional development, bear in mind that there's 2 things that you're wanting to clearly focus on. The first being, I want to be able to identify each individual principle, and then I want to look at how I would apply that within the classroom for my adult learners. So let's have a look at some of the historical background around adult learning, or this concept of andragogy. So adult learning theory was advanced by a professor, Malcolm Knowles. And Professor Malcolm Knowles provided a significant contribution to the field of adult learning theory and adult learning principles from 1980 onward. And Professor Knowles's work continues to be a foundation in the space of adult learning in 2022. Now, prior to Knowles's work, we had Alexander Nape, and Nape's credited for coining the term andragogy. So Nape coined the particular term from the Greek words andr, which means man, and then agogy, which means leading. So when this was pieced together in the Greek, what we then came to read is leading man. So when you start to think about adult learning theory or andragogy, what you're thinking about is learners taking control of their own learning. They're leading their learning. They're embracing their learning. They're self-directing. Now, moving away from Knowles, there are 2 other collaborators who have worked in the space of adult learning theory, have been quite pivotal to this space. And they are Stuart Hass and Chris Kenyon. Now, Hass and Kenyon have advanced this idea of andragogy and brought in a new concept known as hortology. And hortology places an emphasis, or an increased emphasis, on the individual leading their learning. So although Knowles really put emphasis on self-directing one's learning, learners taking control of their own learning. The advancement that Haas and Kenyon were able to make is to say individual students are able to get themselves to the point where they're in charge of their learning. They're the custodians of their learning. They own that space. Now, on slide 3, I'm referring to Malcolm Knowles. So what Knowles did in 1980 when he published his work where he looked at a move to andragogy from pedagogy is to say that adults actually learn differently to children. And because of that, there may be some assumptions we can make. Knowles is not 100% down the line saying that this is what must take place for adult learning. But Knowles developed assumptions. Some of these assumptions may apply, some of them may be fallible and false. So it's our job as educators to look at our learners and see whether these adult learning principles apply to our classrooms. But going back and reinforcing that first point, Knowles identified that adults learn differently than children. So Knowles used the term andragogy to describe adult learning. So that description moved away from the child taking the lead or the child being involved in their learning, which has been central to that concept of pedagogy. Even though we as adult educators in the higher education sector speak to pedagogy as part of our teaching and learning practice. Now, in framing his work, Knowles developed 6 adult learning principles. So we're going to look at those learning principles individually, break them down, and then work towards their application. So the question you might ask yourself is, well, what are the 6 adult learning principles? If you're yet to complete higher education in the discipline or field of education, or a postgraduate in education, or a certificate or a diploma in education, some of these principles could be very new to you. Some of these principles, if you have gone on to further your study in the discipline or field of education, will only help to remind you and reinforce those concepts you've put in place. So principle 1, we're going to look at the need to know. Adult learners need to know. They have a desire to know. Principle 2, self-concept. So for adult learners, they know themselves. They know their wants, they know their needs. And they're willing to put that, for the most part, on the table to advance their learning so they can move into real-world settings, either to generate income or to move towards their career passion. Principle 3, experience. It's important in adult education to provide real-world experience. And as educators, we continue to be in a space of consideration where we ask ourselves, how can we relate the material that we deliver to our students so that students can see how they can apply it now and how they can apply it in the future? Principle 4, a readiness to learn. This is a willingness that students are going to enable change because of their readiness. Many of the students that come into interview for either the New Zealand Certificate in Study and Career Preparation or the Bachelor of Natural Medicine have a readiness and openness to move into an area of passion, an area of focus that has been a long path or dream. Principle 5, orientation to learning. So adult learners are goal-orientated focused. They're problem-centered. They're solution-focused. And they want you as an educator, as their educator, to make their outcomes explicit. Principle 6, motivation. As adult learners, there is an internal drive for our learning. And there's less of a focus on a need for external motivation. Let's look at principle 1, need to know. With the need to know, we have learners that come into South Pacific College, and when they sit before us in any one of the courses that they are enrolled for, they have a need to know. Why are you completing X, Y, and Z? I am an adult. I want to know what you're doing. There's nothing to hide. There's opportunities for transparency. And we're wanting to guide learning so that the adults that sit before us, that we work alongside of and collaborate with, know what they must know moving forward as part of their study journey, and their future career path. Our students are constantly asking questions. Students are asking questions down to a fine point. Our students want to achieve high grades. In order for students to achieve high grades, they want to know. One example we've advanced so far at South Pacific College around Principle 1, the need to know, is to provide deep quality feedback in assessment. That includes when, why, and how a student met a learning outcome in their assignment. Course lecturers detail when, why, and how the student met the learning outcome, and make that very clear to the student and provide constructive feedback so that the student has an understanding on what they can improve on or the area that they've excelled in. Students have a need to know. Principle 2, self-concept. So there are 3 points I wish to make here. On Principle 2 and self-concept, adult learners see themselves as autonomous. They have autonomy over themselves as learners. They are able to direct themselves. They are able to direct their learning. They are able to concentrate and focus their time, awareness, or practice for a key activity. Adult learners are independent. So adult learners that we deliver to as course lecturers can move outside of the classroom and work independently. We're wanting to drive this notion, this principle of self-concept within our classrooms when we first deliver to our students information in a course guideline. Independent learning is a generic transferable attribute that we wish that students work with, advance, continue to take into their field, into their discipline, into their practice after graduation of either the certificate or the degree from South Pacific College. Adult learners are self-directed. When you look at your course guideline and you look at one of the early pages in your course guideline, it outlines very clearly what is the expectation on students. That expectation details teaching time, often for a 15 credit course, that is 150 hours in total. There'll be 64 hours dedicated to teaching, but 86 hours dedicated to self-directed learning. It is important that the adult learner understands Principle 2 self-concept, that they can direct their own learning, they have opportunities to direct their own learning, and they grab those opportunities when they arise. Principle 3. So I will read a quote. Adults accumulate a growing reservoir of experience that becomes an increasingly rich resource for learning. Now, the image that you see on the screen has a number of fields. Rich soil, fertile land. When we look at our adult learners, they have an opportunity to bring to the classroom their reservoir of previous learning, their experience that have shaped them in such a way to bring them before you so that you can deliver to them and advance their experience, add to their experience, change a previous idea that was embedded in an experience, transform an experience. So there's a richness as a course lecturer that you can bring when you look at Principle 3 as one of the 6 adult learning principles. Principle 3, experience. What are you doing in your classroom to ensure that you advance the previous experiences of your students? Is this at the level of constructive alignment when Stacey Jarvis would state in Therapeutics 1, these are the experiences you have with me. When you move into Therapeutics 2, these are the experiences that you'll have with Wayne Hill. Wayne may then further advance the experience by stating, when you move into preclinic, clinical practice 1, Karen Mees will provide these experiences that add to what you have completed in Therapeutics 1 and Therapeutics 2. Provide that rich soil, provide that fertile ground, not only for previous experience, but future experience. Principle 4, a readiness to learn. There is an understanding that the students that come to us are ready. We make the decision how ready they are, and that readiness may evolve and change over time. In 2019, I presented at an international conference in Brisbane, and it was an international congress on complementary medicine. And my focus of the presentation was looking at evidence-based models for complementary medicine degrees. And as part of using that model, I explained the theory of motivation for students in higher education settings. And that when students come into higher education settings, once they have interviewed and been admitted and enrolled into the program, there is a significant spike in readiness and motivation to learn in semester 1. And that continues to increase throughout semester 1, year 1 of a program, until we move into semester 2, where we start to see a drop in readiness, a drop in motivation. And the two often work hand in hand, because if that internal motivation ceases, that readiness for learning and that willingness and that opportunity to enable change in learning starts to taper off. So it's really important as course lecturers that we know from the research that has been completed before us that there's this real drive and spike for readiness in semester one. It dips at the end of semester one into semester two of year one, then plateaus for semester one, year two. If you are delivering a course for semester one, year two, it is one of the most difficult semesters to deliver for. There is a massive level of motivation needed by the student to generate enough passion for what they really want. And do they wish to continue for another 2 years after completing a semester where motivation was low? And it's important to have this appreciation for your students and the cycles that students can go through. And again, these are generalizations from my research and from others, but it's important to put in place a framework and an understanding for these generalizations because they may apply to a number of your students. When you start to move into the end of semester two, second year for a third year degree, you get an increase in motivation again. Students are almost there and their readiness to engage in a clinic experience at SBCNM will be high. There's a tendency between semester one and semester two of a third year degree program where there's again a drop in motivation between semester one and semester two. And students are just wanting to get through and finish their degree. It's our job to lift the students up and to put them into positions where they again have a readiness to learn. So principle 4, readiness to learn. Readiness to learn becomes orientated towards the developmental task of their social roles. What will someone be doing in the future? How will I gain from this? How will I add to this? How will I give from this? Are the questions our students ask themselves moving into their social role. I need to learn because my circumstances are changing. That's where our students come from on day one when they come into interview. That's day one. When they're admitted and enrolled, they've already passed day one to become a naturopath, a herbalist, work in industry, work in research, advance their higher education profile. Their circumstances change. Our circumstances change as course lecturers and as adults. And people desire to learn because of their changing circumstances. Adults have a greater or lesser readiness to learn based on their individual and social context. So as I explained previously with the momentum up and the trajectory down with different semesters and where students are at and their motivation and readiness to learn and their willingness to engage, that can change for the individual at different times throughout their degree journey. It can change based on a social context. One student decides to exit a program. That student who exited the program may have had a significant support network. That will change their trajectory and perhaps a future readiness to re-engage with the program at a time that better suits their situation. Or the reverse, that we have a student who had befriended that individual who decided to exit the program, and because their friend is not there, that added to their readiness to learn. that was an external motivator for them, that may lessen their focus, their concentration, and their orientation towards their learning. That brings us to principle 5. And with principle 5, it is about orientation to learning. So with orientation to learning, as I mentioned, goal-orientated, it is problem-centered, it is solution-focused. And students want you to make the outcomes for a session, an individual session, for a formative assessment, for a summative assessment, for their future real life world circumstances. They want you to make all of that explicit, make it relevant, make it useful. It must be effective. It must be feasible. It must be appropriate. The question to keep asking yourself when you go through these professional developments is not to grill yourself, but to ask yourself the question, am I working these principles in my classroom? Doesn't mean that they're right. They are assumptions. They're fallible. They're open to critique. But what gems exist in this space that you can be applying to your classroom and remain thoughtful of when you guide and deliver to your students? So when we look at orientation to learning, adults are goal-orientated, problem-centered. They want you to make outcomes explicit, really explicit. That's why our students will go to the library manager and say, is this really how I reference? I really want to get an A+. It's down to a very fine line for adult learners. Make it super clear to me. I don't have enough time to muck around looking at a standard in a rubric that outlines an incorrect descriptor. Make it clear to me. If I don't see something, put it in front of me. Guide me so that I can direct my learning. But you must make it explicit first. The last point on slide 10, content should be relevant and useful to the learner's real life. In every session, I can't encourage you enough. I taught a B&M 542 session last week for Foundations of Research. Everything that I focused on was, how is it relevant to you now? Coursework and assessment. How is it relevant to you in industry? How is it relevant to you if you go on to complete higher research degrees, masters, PhD? How is it relevant to you in the clinic space? And I would use stories from my experience in clinic. So I'm still seeing clients on a Saturday and Sunday at the moment. And in that space, I link together how the learning in that session is relevant when you're looking at research and how you must apply it. The feedback from the learners is, thank you, that's exactly what I wanted to know. Go into the detail of you as a clinician, as one example, and why it's relevant, why it's useful, how it's going to center their real world practice. Principle 6, it's the last principle. There are different ideas out there which advance the principles further. 7 principles, 8 principles. When Malcolm Knowles first started and published his work, he looked at 5 principles. It was only later that he added principle 6, motivation. So with principle 6, motivation, internal over external motivation. Internal over external motivation. The adult learner is said to be, based on the assumptions of Knowles, internally driven. But we know a lot of our students require external inputs in order to drive their motivation for change, transformation, and to advance their learning. The quote below that point is, internal motivators are the strongest for adult learners, even though their intrinsic drive to learn may have been dampened by life experience. Adult learners, definitely the adult learners that we have at South Pacific College, see the glass as half full, despite whatever previous experience. They have a motivation and willingness to learn. So important to pull back the curtains, move through the layers, and ask questions to draw out that internal motivation, to re-engage with life experiences that may have compromised the student's investment to fully engage in the experience. But you, as a course lecturer, have the opportunity to do that for your learners. And they too, by being in your presence and being in the space of working with their peers and future colleagues, have opportunities to develop that internal motivation. Now, I've included on slide 12 a reflective activity for you. And I'd just like you to work through this, and you can take whatever time you like, but it'd be great when you're driving in your car, sitting at your desk, just to take a few moments, or in this particular presentation, and work through 3 points. So what I want you to do is either close your eyes or log on to your computer and access the P drive and one of your session plans. You can either visualize this or you can look at the written form of a session plan and work through it. Now, in written form or in visualization, you're contemplating one session from a course you teach. So not the whole course, just one session. So that session plan you did for a particular day within a week that make up the 16 weeks of your course. What I want you to do, whether you're looking at that session or you're visualizing that session and feeling and leaning into it, is from the 6 adult learning principles, I want you to identify 2 dominant and 2 non-dominant principles. So it may be the case that in one of your former sessions or in one of your future sessions, you have paid particular attention to adult learning principle 1. Students need to know. For example, you might start the class outlining clear session objectives and the steps that you'll be taking to move from part A of your session to part B and conclude your session. That may be one of the dominant learning principles in your session. There could also be a non-dominant principle. That non-dominant principle might be around motivation. That motivation needing to be intrinsic for the student, and how you're going to build that up when the focus is a teacher-led lecture style presentation for a particular topic of the coursework. How is motivation going to be attended to for that session, and what are some of the ideas that you can bring in to help assist that internal drive from your students. So after you have contemplated visually in your mind or in written form 2 dominant and 2 non-dominant principles, I then want you to reflect on this question. At the end of your session, which adult learning principles will assist to improve the learner experience? And I want you to justify why. So when you get to the end of that session, visually or in written form via one of your session plans, is there an adult learning principle absent or that needs to become more dominant in that session to improve the learner experience? That may be that there's not a focus on orientation to learning and that the session is needing problem-centered, solution-focused activities. It may be that there's not a link between prior and future experience within a topic. So justify why, but again, think about this question and reflect on it in your teaching. At the end of your session, which adult learning principles will assist to improve the learner experience? Now, it's really important as educators that we're not just looking at a theory or model and not questioning that theory or model. So there are limitations of Knowles' adult learning theory. There are limitations of andragogy. And so let's have a look at 4 of these, and there will be more. So point 1, even though Knowles explains the motivation to learn, what's excluded is context. And authors refer to this context as social mechanisms that construct meaning and knowledge for adult learners. So in the 6 adult learning principles, there's a tendency that although experience, readiness to learn, and orientation to learning are part of the 6 principles, there's not enough focus on individual or group context. So it may be the case that you as an educator need to question, when you're looking at the concept of motivation being internal, that some of your students will not have that intrinsic drive. And it may be that you need to construct meaningful learning experiences for the student to be driven towards an internal motivation. Point 2, is self-directed learning truly achievable? I have so many meetings throughout a semester with students on their self-directed time. Students are largely unaware, despite their high level of intelligence, when under stress, they are unable to time manage well. And we're familiar with this process as course lecturers working at a college that delivers certificate and degree programs, and the amount of effort, time, and work that's been put into the culture of teaching and learning at South Pacific College. You're aware that self-directed learning is a difficult space to navigate, even for the most ready of learners, even for the most motivated of learners. So is it actually achievable? When you outline it very clearly to students, and what I mean by that is I sit students down, I say to them, there's 168 hours in a week, you need to sleep this amount of hours, this is a recommendation, how many hours are you working, how many hours are you studying, to get to the point of, well, how many hours are left for self-directed learning? And at that time, are you actually motivated to engage self-concept, be self-directed? Make decisions. If you're a mother of a young child and you're exhausted and your time for study was going to be between 9 p.m. and midnight, self-directed learning, no matter the motivation, is not appropriate within the context, and meaningful learning will not take place in that space. So there's a question on whether we should turn our attention to directed self-learning. So we still have this concept of self-directed learning, but we put our students in situations of, okay, you've now finished this learning with me. What I want you to do before next session is this, but how I want you to do it is in class as a group, or what I want you to do if you're in the situation of completing this task individually is that it is best to complete this task when you have a higher level of motivation and generally of a morning. Set the context, set the space, make sure that the mechanisms, those causal properties that are going to lift motivation for students, help students direct their energy into their study, are in place, and make them explicit. 3, do we need to consider the influence of culture, society, institutional structures on learning process? So even though students need to know, they have a self-concept, adult learners have previous experience, they've got a readiness to learn, orientation to learning, and motivation. Do we need to consider the influence of culture, society, and institutional structures on learning processes? We definitely need to consider. There is an influence from the culture out there that has an impact on learning at South Pacific College. Culture has an impact on how individual learners engage. For a previous workshop that all staff were involved in around teaching and learning, specific to Māori, a question was presented in terms of culture by the facilitator. And that question was, for Māori students in a class, did they prefer to engage and work with Māori, Pākehā, or other cultures for their self-directed learning? And the answer was that they preferred to work in a collaborative group and work with other Māori students. This is the data that comes back that demonstrates, as one example, the influence of culture on the learning process, despite the adult learning principles. Society. Society is out there. It shapes our classroom. It shapes the agents in our classroom. Those agents are you as a course lecturer and your students as individuals. That society affects interaction in the classroom space, collaboration in the classroom space, respect in the classroom space. How many times are you delivering in class with adult learners engaged in other conversation? on a mobile device, leaving class early because of work commitments and work demands. Institutional structures. So what impact do resources, classroom environments have on the learning process despite your knowledge and understanding of the 6 principles of adult learning? Point 4, is it necessary for educators to consider collaborative learning? It certainly is. We must do that at South Pacific College because one of our generic transferable attributes is about collaborative learning. There needs to be a move towards greater group work, interaction. And even within the industry of natural medicine, we're well aware of a lack of interdisciplinarity. The idea that biomedicine and natural medicine can work together and that despite difference, there are similarities and that both disciplines can come together and continue to evolve health practice into the future. Now, Renga Tiritanga is a Māori concept that is about sovereignty, leadership, and the leadership is about the coming together of knowledge, the coming together of people. And this is a new graduate profile outcome moving into the New Zealand certificate in studying career preparation, which will move to version 2, which will be the New Zealand certificate in study and employment pathways. And this idea of sovereignty, this idea of leadership, this idea of group work is about bringing community together. And it's really important for this collaborative learning space that we drive this in our classrooms. Classroom application. We had 2 objectives in this session. The first objective for this session was 1, identify 6 principles of adult learning. We just completed that. The second objective is to look at application in the classroom. Now, you will already have multiple applications as a long-term qualified higher education or certificate trainer, as a long-term learner yourself, and working in the higher education space as a course lecturer. So when we look at principle 1, I've placed 2 examples. So around this idea of need to know, are you informing learners of the purpose, learning objectives, and agenda for the learning session at the beginning of the session? Do you tell learners when, what, and how they will be expected to engage with their course? Do you outline that? And I don't mean just on day 1. Do you set the tone for your session at the beginning at every session? Because what students and adult learners are looking for is how are they going to plan? How are they going to conduct themselves? How are they going to review their learning and then move back into an assessment of how they will best plan, how they will best engage, how they can improve their reflexivity around the review process? So are you setting the tone? You're definitely setting the tone as an academic team when it comes to feedback in assessment. When, what, how, that learning outcome, that particular topic within that task. Second to none, excellent feedback. Principle 2, self-concept. Are you assisting the student to build self-esteem? In building that self-esteem, is that coming through for each of the sessions that you deliver? Are you able to offer this online? Where I see self-esteem being built is in kinesthetic, practical learning environments. That is where it's currently strong in the degree program. So in the context of the certificate and year 1 and year 2 courses and some year 3 courses, where do we see opportunities to build self-esteem for students? It may be small in terms of encouragement, but that encouragement needs to have an obvious function for real-world practice in the future, for a student's self-esteem to improve within a program. For that intrinsic motivation to improve, self-esteem is a catalyst. So what are you doing in year 1? What are you doing in year 2? What are you doing in the certificate to move students into a higher self-esteem, opportunities to rediscover their self-esteem? Under Principle 2 self-concept, I also have down, ask learners what they want to take away from their learning at the end of a session. If self-concept includes self-direction, if it includes decision-making, put it back on adult learners. Adult learner, what do you want to take home with you after this session, now that you know the session objective? At that point in your session, what do you want to take away? What do you want to get out of this class? If you've completed the pre-reading, if you've been here for the last 4 sessions, you'll see that we're moving into this particular topic area. What are you wanting to start taking away from this? You're going to get evidence of their concept. You're going to receive feedback on how you can better shape and transform learning for that individual. Principle 3, experience. Employ role plays and case studies that mimic real-world situations for learners. In Foundations of Research, you could start pulling out your hair behind the scenes when you're working to put together a case summary and report for a real-world client. It's very important that our students see aspects of the real world until they get to jump into an experience that they must experience for them to feel the full depth of a situation. But if that jump is too big, our graduate pathways, our graduates moving into long-term, well-established careers is less according to verbal feedback, scholarship, and long-term research. What are you doing in your course that mimics real-world situations? Can you provide students with a visual? If you want to know how you can break out of the mindset that you may be in that could be restrictive to this space, I strongly recommend that you sit in one of the practical classes for mind body that's led by Mirella Lascarine. Mirella is very clever at providing opportunities to mimic real-world situations for learners and put them in that space quickly. Principle 3, experience. We've got one more point on that on slide 14. Provide session time for learners to work on key deliverables. If there's an assessment coming up and you've got 40 minutes in your session, before you fill that, ask yourself the question, is it a better use of time for students to engage in assessment, whether formative or summative, in the class while you're there to answer questions in real time? Also, breaking assessment up. So if there's an essay due, why is not one of the formative tasks how to write an introduction? What topics and themes do you include in the body of your essay for your summative essay? Have dates with a key deliverable. So we're going to get this summative essay completed, but there's going to be opportunities in class so you can ask me questions in real time. Students get to experience how to complete an introduction, how to complete subheadings within a body, how to complete an effective conclusion, and piece that together in stages. Principle 4, readiness to learn. So with a readiness to learn, why don't you schedule unstructured time for learner conversation and bonding? An opportunity for students to speak to areas of struggle, areas of challenge, areas of passion, areas of hope, growth, maturation. Provide opportunities for learners to teach each other new content. Are you always up the front? Are you always needing to deliver? Lynette Hill, in Principles and Philosophy of Natural Medicine, runs an activity where it is student-led and students on campus or online are writing down answers for an activity. And in writing down answers either on the whiteboard in the physical classroom or the whiteboard in the virtual classroom, students are leading that space and they're teaching other students. And one experience I had for that particular class in an individual session is that more growth, more conversation came out of that individual activity for all of the students. And Lynette continued to move herself out of the circle and the situation was led by the students. It's brilliant. Principle 5, orientation to learning. Solicit learner input in determining session structure, learning topics and learning activities where possible. So the context is such within the institutional space of NZQA and our regulators where students do not have the experience and the education that you do on this is exactly how it should be structured, this is the learning topic, and these should be all of the learning activities that you'll deliver for B&M 531 Herbal Medicine 1. That is not possible. But what is possible is feedback on maybe we could change the structure because our motivation's really high early on and we would like to reverse the process. So we would like to start with an activity to see what our understanding and what our experience is of that topic and then jump into a learning. So activities before the lecture. So this is about contextualizing learning for your students and structuring it in a way that sets your class up for success. Perhaps the learning activities are too long or too short, they need more time. Feedback from your students will provide the opportunity to make that change. Learning topics. You may present a very important learning topic. An example is that for Foundations of Research, BNN 542, when I delivered to students last week, I delivered information on hierarchies of evidence. And one student said, I would love that to be over 2 sessions because there's so much content there. Now, hierarchies of evidence is extremely important for clinic, for industry, and for higher education degrees. So we're delivering it in 1 session. Potentially we need to review and look at it for Foundations of Research over 2. There's so much topic information on that particular area. Require learners to formally indicate how they plan to apply the learning to their own situation. Why not draw that out? Get students to build mind maps, conceptual maps. Ask the student to write down in a sentence, a paragraph, half a page, how they plan to apply the learning to their own situation. Why are you coming up with everything all the time when it's an adult learner sitting in front of you with previous experience? Orientation to learning is about being goal-orientated, problem-centered, solution-focused. Yes, we want to make information explicit to the student. We can do that when we know where they're coming from. To know where they're coming from, we need to ask questions. So why not require learners to formally indicate to you by asking them how they plan to apply their learning to their own situation? Principle 6, motivation. So 2 points here as an example. You could use questioning to draw session content from learners. Some students like that, but again, Knowles's assumptions around adult learners does not dictate to individual learners who may feel that they're unable to contribute in a classroom environment because they feel anxious or overwhelmed. So in that particular space, it may not be contextualized for all, but for some, yes. Ask learners to volunteer for supporting roles in class. So there's opportunities to assist with active panel. There's opportunities to assist in changing, transforming classroom structure. There's opportunities in a breakout room for a student to be the note taker, a student to be the representative of a group, a student to go off and research within a particular activity. Are you developing supporting roles that motivate students that you link to their real world experience? You're going to be taking notes as a clinician. You're going to be taking notes in industry when you're speaking to any of your clientele as their representative for a particular company, NutriSearch, FXMed, Metagenics. Are you going to write copious and volumes of information when you're going into higher education programs? You better believe it. Are you going to show leadership skills? Are you going to stand up the front and present for Metagenics, for NutriSearch? We currently have Adri Ferreira from NutriSearch delivering functional pathology sessions fortnightly throughout the semester for our students. Adri's in that position, working in industry, constantly delivering to students. Think about what supporting roles you give out during your session to advance the adult learner experience then and in the future. So let's just do a review of the session objective. 1, can you now identify the 6 adult learning principles? If not, go back and review those principles, re-listen to this professional development, and consider, point 2, what strategies could you apply to support adult learning principles for your course? Continue to go over that reflective activity early on in this professional development session and consider what is needed for any individual session to support your adult learners. The final slide provides 5 references. There are numerous resources on adult learning principles, and I encourage you as a certificate and as a degree course lecturer to engage with the scholarly material and have a clear understanding on how you as an educator can better advance your own practice and the learning outcomes of your students. I hope that this particular professional development has been informative, that has provided you with information to reinforce your learning or new concepts to advance your learning going forward. I will now stop the session, and as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please email me or get in contact with me to organise a meeting. Thank you.